William Lloyd Garrison was born in Newburyport, Massachusetts in 1805. Due to the large measure to the Embargo Act, the Garrison family fell on hard times, while William was still young. In 1808, William's father deserted the family, thus forcing William to work selling homemade molasses candy and delivering wood. In 1818, after suffering through various apprenticeships, Garrison began to work for the Newburyport Herald as a writer and editor. This job would give the young Garrison the skills he would utilize so expertly when he later published his own paper. When he was 25, Garrison joined the abolition movement. He became associated with the American Colonizational Society. At first glance, the society seemed to promote the freedom and happiness of blacks. There certainly were members who encouraged the granting of freedom to slaves. However, it turned out that the number of members advocating freedom constituted a minority. Most members had no wish to free slaves. Their goal was only to reduce the number of free blacks in the country and thus help preserve the institution of slavery. By 1830, Garrison had rejected the programs of the American Colonizational Society. By this time, he had worked as co-editor of the anti-slavery paper started by Benjamin Lundy in Maryland, The Genius of Universal Emancipation. And on January 1st, 1831, he published the first issue of his own anti-slavery newspaper, The Liberator. In speaking engagements and though The Liberator and other publications, Garrison advocated the immediate emancipation of all slaves. This was an unpopular view during the 1830s, even with Northerners who were against slavery. Certainly they could not assimilate into American society, they thought. Garrison believed that they could assimilate. He believed that in time all blacks would be equal in every way to the country's white citizens. They too were Americans and entitled to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. In 1832, he helped organize a New England Anti-Slavery Society, and the following year, the American Anti-Slavery Society. These were the first organizations dedicated to promoting immediate emancipation. Garrison was unyielding and steadfast in his beliefs. He believed that the Anti-Slavery Society should not align itself with any public party. He believed that women should be allowed to participate in the Anti-Slavery Society. He believed that the USA Constitution was a pro-slavery document. In 1861, as the American Civil War broke out, Garrison continued to criticize the U.S. Constitution, The Liberator, a process of resistance that Garrison had now practiced for nearly 20 years. Understandably, some found it surprising when the pacifists also used his journalism to support Abraham Lincoln and his war policies, even prior to the Emancipation Proclamation of September of 1862. When the Civil War came to a close in 1865, Garrison at last saw his dream come to reality. With the 13th Amendment, slavery was outlawed throughout the United States.
William Lloyd Garrison and Frederick Douglass were quite similar but very different as well. Both of the men were famous abolitionists. Their views on most topics of their time were quite similar, and when attacked in public, they would defend one another. Both were strong-willed and ambitious survivors. They often shared the stage. Both had their own papers. Garrison was called the Liberator, and Douglass was called the North Star. They were different because Douglass had been fortunate enough to publish 3 books. They differed because Douglass was into oral presentation of his ideas, where Garrison preferred writing. Garrison was also of European descent, where Douglass was half African American and half European, and born into slavery. Douglass' views on the Civil War were of more defensive strategy, where Garrison opposed the war and believed in a peaceful world. Douglass was also influential to Abraham Lincoln in ways Garrison never was. Douglass was the most prominent man of the 19th century, being called the most impressive man I have ever met by Abraham Lincoln himself.
Frederick Douglass was a runaway slave. He's been called the father of the civil rights movement. He arose through determination and brilliance to shape the American nation. He was an abolitionist, human rights and women's rights activist, author, journalist, publisher, and social reformer. Most slaves couldn't read or write, but for this slave, Frederick broke that barrier and many more. He realized his ability to read was the key to freedom. Born into slavery in 1818, he became a major figure in the crusade for abolition and the effort during Reconstruction to give meaning to black freedom. Frederick was the son of a slave mother and experienced slavery in all its varieties, from work as a house servant and skilled craftsman. In 1838, having borrowed the free papers of a black sailor, he escaped to the north and soon became a known writer against slavery. In his speech of July 1852, he wrote, "What to a slave is the 4th of July." This speech is unique because it is an actual encounter of a slave's perspective of 4th of July. It is shown throughout that a slave feels that being human means being free. Also, for one to truly understand and know the true values of freedom, one must understand denial and put him or herself in a slave's position. To a slave, being human means being free. Since a slave has no freedom, he has no sense of humanity. Douglas relates his reader to the life of a slave while at the same time explaining how one could never understand unless he experiences the hardships of slavery on his own.